Ed Gein, one of the most disturbing and unusual figures in the world of serial killers. Ed Gein is one of the most chilling and unconventional figures in the world of serial killers. His crimes surpassed even the most terrifying urban legends, becoming a source of horror and inspiration for famous characters in cinema and literature. Gein wasn't a traditional serial killer, as his motives were closely tied to deep psychological issues, an obsession with his mother, and a pathological attraction to human remains. Early years and life under mother's control. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin. He grew up in a family dominated by strict and conservative religious views. His mother, Augusta Gein, was the dominant figure in his life. She was a zealous Lutheran and believed that all women, except herself, were instruments of the devil. Her views on sexuality and morality were extremely severe. She instilled in her sons the idea that women were a source of sin and should be avoided. Because of this, Ed and his older brother Henry were isolated from society and had very little contact with the outside world. For Ed, his mother was the only person to whom he was strongly emotionally attached. Her authoritarian influence and absolute control over his life created mental pathologies in him that later manifested in horrifying actions. Ed adored his mother and was ready to do anything to please her. After his father's death in 1940 and subsequently his brother Henry's death in a fire, Ed was left alone with his mother, and their bond only grew stronger. Loss of mother and the beginning of horrors. In 1945, Ed's mother died from a stroke. For Gein, this was a real shock, as she was the center of his world. After her death, he couldn't cope with the loss and continued to live in their remote farmhouse in isolation. Ed left the main rooms that his mother had used untouched, preserving them in their original state like a museum. He lived in a small part of the house filled with junk and garbage. It was after his mother's death that Ed began to act unusually. He became obsessed with the idea of bringing her back. It's important to note that Ed Gein didn't commit as many murders as traditional serial killers, as his pathology lay elsewhere. The main part of his horrifying actions involved digging up the bodies of women who had died of natural causes from local cemeteries. He confessed that for several years, he had been exhuming bodies from cemeteries at night, acting alone without attracting the attention of law enforcement or Plainfield residents. He chose women who reminded him of his mother. They had to be middle-aged, with appearances that somewhat reflected the image of Augusta Gein. These stolen bodies became the primary material for his terrible crafts. Gein used human skulls as bowls, skin for making lampshades and chairs, and also made masks and clothing from human parts. The most horrifying fact was that he tried to create a suit from human skin that would allow him to become his mother, indicating deep psychological trauma and a strong obsession with her. Discovery of crimes. On November 13, 1957, shopkeeper Bernice Wardens disappeared in the town of Plainfield. Her disappearance became an alarming signal for local residents. The investigation quickly led police to Ed Gein's farm, as he was one of the last to visit Warden's store on the day of her disappearance. When the police entered Gein's house, they discovered one of the most horrifying scenes in criminal history. Bernice Warden's body was found decapitated and dismembered, hanging in the barn. However, the police experienced the greatest horror when they began to examine Gein's house. Inside were numerous items made from human bodies, bowls made from skulls, masks made from human faces, a belt made of women's nipples, as well as clothing sewn from human skin. During the investigation, Ed confessed that for several years he had been digging up bodies from local cemeteries and using them for his gruesome creations. He also confessed to the murder of another woman, local barmaid Mary Hogan, who had disappeared a few years earlier. His pathological behavior and actions indicated severe disturbances in his perception of reality. He often blurred the line between the living and the dead, and also had problems with sexual identity. Trial and consequences. After his arrest, Ed Gein was found mentally incompetent and unable to stand trial immediately. He was placed in a psychiatric hospital for treatment. Only after several years was he deemed fit to stand trial, and he was charged with the murder of Bernice Wardens. He pleaded guilty, but due to his mental state, he was not sentenced to death or long-term imprisonment. Gein spent the rest of his life in a psychiatric hospital, where he died of cancer in 1984. Gein's psychological profile. Ed Gein was an atypical serial killer. His crimes were not motivated by reasons traditional for serial killers, such as sexual gratification or a desire to control the victim. His actions were dominated by a pathological attachment to his mother and an attempt to bring her back into his life. He created a suit from women's skin to become his mother, as his own sense of identity was blurred. Psychiatrists who worked with Ed diagnosed him with serious mental disorders, including schizophrenia. Impact on popular culture. Ed Gein's crimes have become a source of inspiration for numerous works of fiction.